The dog should not have been alive. That was the first thing Decker Hale thought when he saw it, not what happened to it, not where it came from, not how long it had been lying there under the tangle of wet branches and frost-blackened leaves at the base of the ridge. Just that simple clinical assessment that his mind produced before anything else could reach it. The dog should not have been alive. And yet it was. He had been walking for 4 hours when he heard the sound. Not a bark, not quite a whimper. Something in between, something lower and more fractured than either, carried on the November wind through the ponderosa pines of the San Juan Mountains in a way that made it hard to locate at first, hard to distinguish from the general voice of the forest in cold weather. Decker had stopped on the trail and stood very still and listened, the way he had learned to listen in places where listening was the difference between one outcome and another. He had been still for a long time before he moved toward the sound, and he had moved carefully, which was also something he had learned. He had come to Colorado without a plan. That was not entirely accurate. He had a plan in the sense that he had a truck and a trailhead and a permit for dispersed camping in the wilderness area above 12,000 feet. And he had supplies for 8 days packed with the systematic efficiency of a man who had been packing for hostile environments since he was 23. But he had not come here for any of the reasons that people usually came to places like this. Not for the scenery, though. The scenery was extraordinary in the specific way of high country in November when the aspens had gone and the snow lay in the north-facing hollows. And the sky above the peaks was the particular blue that only existed at altitude and only in autumn. Not for the solitude exactly, though solitude was part of it. He had come because he had run out of other things to try. 15 years of service had given Decker Hale a specific set of skills and a specific kind of damage, and the two were not as easily separated as the people who worked with veterans sometimes implied. He had tried the programs. He had tried the therapy, which he did not dismiss because he was not the kind of man who dismissed things without examining them first, and which had helped in the specific ways that it could help and had not helped in the specific ways that it could not. He had tried work, civilian work, which paid adequately and required a fraction of his capacity and left the rest of him with nothing to do but exist in the silence of an apartment in Denver that he had furnished with the minimum necessary to call it furnished and had never quite managed to call home. The nights were the main problem, not the dreams, though there were dreams, the in-between times. The hour before sleep and the hour after waking when his mind, which had been trained to process threat and plan response at all hours and in all conditions, had nothing to process and nothing to plan for. And so it processed and planned around the materials it had available to it, which were memories. He had developed strategies for the nights. None of them worked very well. Some of them worked well enough. He had come to the mountains because at altitude and cold in terrain that required his full attention to navigate safely, his mind had something real to do, something that used the full measure of what had been built in him without the cost that had come with the building. He was not running away from anything. He had examined that possibility and rejected it with the same thoroughness he applied to everything. He was simply going toward the only place he could currently think of where he felt like himself. The sound came again. Closer this time, or he was closer to it, his movement through the trees having reduced the distance without his quite deciding to reduce it. He pushed through the lower branches of a pine and found the dog. It lay half beneath a fallen branch, its body partly sheltered by the debris that had collected around the base of the tree, its fur matted with mud and dried blood, and the wet of nights spent in the open at temperatures that should have killed it. Its right front leg was at an angle that no leg should be at. Along its left side, visible through the thinned fur where something had torn, it was a wound that had bled substantially at some point and had since closed in, the way that wounds close when there is nothing left to close them with except the body's own stubbornness. It was a medium-sized dog mixed breed by the look of it, with a coat that would have been reddish-brown before everything happened to it, and that was now the color of the forest floor it lay on. 4 years old, maybe 5. Female, he noted automatically. She was trembling. Her breathing was shallow and uneven in the specific way of a body that was working very hard at the simple task of continuing to breathe. Her eyes were open. They found his face when he crouched down, and they stayed there. Decker had worked with dogs in his operational years, and he knew something about reading canine behavior under stress. A dog in pain and fear in an unfamiliar situation did predictable things. It growled, it tried to retreat, it showed its teeth, it made itself small, and then exploded when the threat came close enough. These were the behaviors of an animal responding to the situation it was actually in, which was a situation of injury and danger and the proximity of an unknown human. This dog did none of those things. She looked at him the way you look at something you have been expecting. Not with relief, not yet, because relief requires knowing that the expectation has been met, and she could not know that yet. With recognition, as though the face she was looking at was the face that belonged to this moment, and she had known it would arrive and had been waiting for it. He had seen that look before in his life, in different faces, in different circumstances. He knew what it meant. It meant you are the one who is going to do something about this. He removed his pack and set it on the ground beside him and opened the medical kit he carried on principle and had used more times than he liked to count in various contexts. He examined the leg first, running his hands along it with the careful precision of someone who had learned field assessment from people who knew what they were doing. The fracture was midshaft on the radius. Clean break as far as he could tell without imaging, no compound fracture, no catastrophic displacement. Bad enough. Bad enough that she should not have been walking on it. But the kind of injury a dog survived if the circumstances cooperated. The wound on her side was older. Several days. It had closed and would not reopen if left alone. There was no sign of active infection that he could assess without tools he didn't have, but no smell of it either, which was a reasonable proxy indicator. She was severely dehydrated. She was hypothermic to a degree. She was exhausted in the way of a creature that has been spending energy reserves it did not have. He worked quickly and without unnecessary movement, improvising a splint from the straight section of a branch he found within reach, and the materials in his kit immobilizing the leg as well as he could manage without the tools the job properly required. She let him do it. She made a sound once, a low sound that was not quite a whimper, when he had to move the leg to position the splint, and then she was quiet again, watching his hands work. He talked to her while he worked. He could not have said exactly when he started doing it or what he said first. It was not something he decided to do. It was something that happened the way certain things happened when you were doing precise work in difficult conditions, and the part of the mind that managed speech became available because the part of the mind that managed action was fully occupied. He told her what he was doing as he did it step by step in the quiet, even tone he had learned to use in situations that required calm. He told her it was going to hold. He told her she had done well to get this far. He did not think about the fact that he had not spoken to another living being in 4 days. When the splint was finished and the wound had been cleaned as well as he could manage, and she had drunk from the collapsible bowl he filled from his water supply, he sat back on his heels and looked at her and thought about what came next. The correct answer was to carry her out, get her to a road, get her to a vehicle, get her to a veterinarian. The trail back to the trailhead was 2.5 miles on terrain he knew and had walked that morning. He could do it in under an hour, carrying her weight, which he estimated at 50 pounds, maybe 55. It would be dark by the time he reached the truck, but he had his headlamp and he knew the trail. That was the correct answer. He started to shift his position to lift her. She moved. Not away from him, not a reflexive flinch or a defensive scramble. She moved with intention, shifting her body so that she was no longer lying but was half upright, her good legs under her, her splinted leg extended to the side. She looked at him for a moment, making sure he was watching. And then she looked toward the trees, not randomly, not a distracted glance. A sustained, directed look, specific in its orientation toward a particular section of the forest that lay deeper into the mountains, away from the trail, away from the trailhead, and the truck and the road and everything that constituted the correct answer. Then she looked back at him. He had worked with dogs who were trained to indicate. Dogs whose job was to communicate the location or presence of something that the humans around them could not detect on their own. He knew what indication looked like. He knew the difference between a dog looking at a thing because it was looking and a dog looking at a thing because the thing was what it was trying to show you. This was the second kind. He looked at the trees in the direction she had indicated. Pines, slopes, the terrain rising toward the higher country. No trail, no visible landmark from this position, nothing he could see that explained the look she had given him. She made the sound again, not the whimper of pain from before. Something different, directed, the sound of an animal communicating with intention. Decker Hale sat in the forest on the slope of the San Juan Mountains in November and looked at a dog that should not have been alive and thought about the question that her eyes were asking him. He was a man who understood priorities. The dog's survival was the priority. The trail back to the truck was the correct path to ensure the dog's survival. Every calculation that his training and his experience and his reason produced pointed in the same direction, which was back the way he had come. He was also a man who had learned over 15 years of work in environments where the difference between the obvious answer and the right answer was sometimes significant to pay attention, when something with good instincts was telling him that the obvious answer was not the complete picture. She had not survived whatever had happened to her by accident. She had not managed with a broken leg and an open wound and days of exposure in November at altitude to still be alive and still be oriented and still be looking at him with that particular quality of attention by accident. Something in this animal had decided that survival was necessary and had sustained that decision through conditions that argued strongly against it and was now communicating to him with everything it had that there was a reason the survival had been necessary. He thought about the direction she had looked. He thought about the way she had looked at him when he first crouched down beside her, not like a dog found by a stranger, like a dog found by the person it had been waiting for. He made his decision in the way he made all decisions, which was to make it and then act on it without spending additional time on the making. He adjusted the way he was holding her, shifting her weight so that her splinted leg was supported and her head was elevated, distributing the 50+ pounds of her across his arms in the way that would let him carry her at a sustainable pace over uneven terrain for however long was necessary. She settled into his arms without resistance. She turned her head toward the trees she had indicated. He walked into them. The terrain immediately became harder. The ground sloped upward and then traversed and then sloped upward again, and the trees grew closer together here where the trail did not go and no one had cleared the lower branches. He had to adjust his footing constantly, reading the ground ahead and placing each step with the care that the combination of failing light and unfamiliar terrain required. She was heavy in the way that unconscious weight is heavy, not fighting him but not helping him either. Just present in his arms with the full measure of her weight in the specific configuration that her injury required him to maintain. He walked for 30 minutes, then 40. The light was going in the way that light goes in the mountains, not slowly and then quickly like it does in cities, but all at once when the sun dropped below the ridgeline and everything went from amber to gray in the span of a few minutes. He found his headlamp with one hand while the other maintained its position under her and clicked it on. She lifted her head periodically. When she did, it was always to look ahead into the trees toward wherever they were going, not at him, at the destination. As though she was navigating, he followed her navigation. The forest opened slightly as he crossed a small drainage, the trees thinning enough that he could see the slope above him and the sky above the slope. And he stopped for a moment to catch his breath and adjust his grip and look at what was ahead. Through the trees further up the slope, he could see a shape, a structure, low and dark against the lighter dark of the snow that lay on the ground above the drainage. An A-frame or something close to it, set back against the rock of the ridge in the way of buildings that had been placed where the terrain offered some protection from the weather. No lights, no smoke from where a chimney should be, no sign of occupation that he could see from this distance. She lifted her head and looked at it. He had been in situations before where something felt wrong before he could articulate why, where the information his senses were gathering was producing an output that his conscious mind had not yet assembled into a coherent explanation. He had learned to trust that output. It had never been infallible, but it had been right often enough that he had stopped requiring an explanation before he allowed it to influence his behavior. Something felt wrong about the cabin. Not wrong in the sense of dangerous to him. Wrong in the sense of a thing that was not as it should be. The absence of smoke when it was below freezing and there was a wood stove, and the kind of person who came to a place like this at this time of year would know to use it. The door, which he could see now as he moved closer, was not fully closed, standing open perhaps 6 inches, letting the cold in when any person who was functional inside would have closed it. He moved faster up the slope. She was still in his arms when he reached the cabin door. He pushed it open with his foot, the hinges protesting in the way of hinges that needed attention, and stepped inside. The air was cold, not as cold as outside, but close. The cold of a space where a fire had gone out some time ago, and the insulation of the structure was the only thing standing between the interior and the November night. It smelled of wood ash and something else, something he recognized without wanting to recognize it. His headlamp swept the space. A main room, a wood stove against one wall dark, a table with a coffee cup still on it, a sleeping bag on a cot against the far wall, supplies stacked in the corner with the organized logic of someone who had been intending to be here for a while, signs of habitation, recent habitation. She shifted in his arms. The movement was deliberate, a slow turn of her body toward the narrow hallway he could see at the back of the main room. And she made the sound again, the directed sound, the communication sound. And he looked at the hallway and knew what he was going to find before he found it. He walked toward it. The door at the end was closed. He shifted her weight to his left arm and opened the door with his right hand. The man on the floor was in his 60s, gray-haired, wearing the clothes of someone who had dressed for the outdoors and had not changed them in several days. He lay on his back with his knees slightly bent, unconscious, pale in the specific way of pale that came from blood loss and the body's allocation of remaining resources away from the surface and toward the core. His breathing was audible, even from the doorway, shallow and irregular. Along his right side, visible because his jacket had been pushed up at some point and not rearranged, was a bandage made from fabric that had been white and was now almost entirely dark with dried blood. He had been there for days. He had bandaged his own wound with what he had and had made it as far as this room and had gone down and had not gotten up. Decker set the dog down gently on the floor just inside the doorway. She settled immediately, tucking her good legs under her, her eyes on the man. She did not go to him. She simply watched the watchfulness of an animal that has done what it came to do and is now waiting to see what happens next. Decker crossed the room and crouched beside the man and checked his pulse. It was there, weak and irregular, but there. His skin was cold. His breathing when Decker put his hand near his face was moving air, but not enough of it. He was alive. He had probably been alive for longer than he should have been given the evidence of the situation around him. He had been alive through days of hold and blood loss and the kind of isolation that was its own category of damage. And his body was still doing the work of being alive, even though it was running very low on whatever it used to do that work. Decker looked at the dog in the doorway. She had come for him. That was the only explanation that fit all of the facts. She had left this man in this cabin and had gone out into the forest with a broken leg and had waited, and when Decker came within the range of her ability to summon him, she had summoned him. She had led him here across terrain that she could barely cross on 3 working legs, carrying the injury that should have stopped her long before it did. She had not left to save herself. She had left to save him. Decker opened his pack. He had work to do, a great deal of work, and not very much time before the temperature inside this unheated cabin made the work harder than it already was, and a storm coming that would make everything harder still. He had done difficult things in difficult places with inadequate resources. He set his hands to it. The first thing Decker did was get the fire going. Not because warmth was the most urgent need, the warmth was urgent. Because without heat, the situation would deteriorate faster than he could manage it, and he needed time. Time was the resource he was shortest on, and the wood stove was the only thing in this cabin that could buy him more of it. He found the wood stacked neatly on the porch, covered with a tarp that had been weighted down with rocks on each corner, the preparation of someone who intended to be here for a while and had thought ahead. He brought in 4 armloads before he started the fire, stacking it inside the door where it would stay dry, thinking about the mathematics of heat and duration and how long the wood would need to last. The kindling was in a box beside the stove, and the matches were on the shelf above it. Whoever had built this cabin had done it with the logic of a person who understood that things should be where you needed them when you needed them. The fire caught on the second attempt, and he fed it carefully, not rushing it, letting it build from the kindling to the smaller splits to the larger logs in the sequence that produced sustained heat rather than a fast burn that exhausted itself. He kept one ear on the man in the back room while he worked, listening for any change in the rhythm of the breathing he could barely hear through the doorway. The breathing stayed the same. Bad, but the same. Juniper had not moved from the doorway of the back room. She lay with her chin on the threshold, her good eye visible from where Decker knelt at the stove, watching the man on the floor with the fixed attention of an animal that has made watching into a form of presence, a way of being close that the injury and the exhaustion would not allow her to be in any other form. When the fire was established and the temperature in the main room had begun its slow climb upward, Decker went back to the man. He worked through the assessment systematically the way he had been trained to work, not from the most obvious problem outward, but from the most immediately life-threatening problem outward, which was a different order and sometimes a counterintuitive one. Airway first. The man was breathing on his own, compromised but functional. Circulation. The pulse was thready and too fast, the response of a cardiovascular system working at elevated effort to maintain pressure it was having trouble maintaining. Body temperature. He found the thermometer in his kit and got a reading that confirmed what the color of the man's skin and the coldness of his extremities had already suggested. Hypothermic. Not critically, not yet, but trending in a direction that would become critical if the environment didn't change. The wound was the source of most of what was wrong. He cut away the improvised bandaging carefully, working around where it had adhered to the dried blood, and looked at what was underneath. A puncture wound deep along the right side below the rib cage. Not a stab wound. The geometry was wrong for that. Something had penetrated from below at an angle, something with a pointed profile. A broken branch, possibly in a fall, the kind of injury that happened to people who were moving through terrain too quickly or who lost their footing on ice-crusted rock. The wound itself had closed. There was no active bleeding. But the tissue around it was inflamed in a way that told him infection had established itself and had been establishing itself for several days, and the man's body temperature, which should have been fighting that infection with fever, was instead being suppressed by the hypothermia, which meant the immune response was compromised. He was losing on two fronts simultaneously. Cold and infection working together in the specific way that combinations of damage worked, each making the other harder to address. Decker had antibiotics in his kit. He carried them because he had operated in environments where they were the difference between someone making it out and not making it out. And the habit had carried into his civilian life the way many habits had carried into his civilian life unremarked upon and useful. He got a reading on the man's weight by estimation, looking at the frame of him, the height, the build, and calculated the dose with the careful arithmetic of someone who understood that both too little and too much were problems, and that neither was an acceptable error. He got fluids into the man first, the small supply of intravenous fluids he carried, which was enough to begin addressing the dehydration and to provide a path for the antibiotics to enter the bloodstream faster than they would through the gut. He had done this in conditions that made this cabin look like a hospital. He worked without anxiety, with the focused attention of someone performing a task they understood, and he did not think about whether it would be enough. Thinking about whether it would be enough was not a productive use of the cognitive resources he needed for doing the work. When he had done what he could do medically, he turned to the problem of temperature. He brought the sleeping bag from the cot in the main room and arranged it around the man on the floor, not trying to move him, working with where he was tucking the insulation around and beneath him in the configuration that would trap the most body heat. He put his own sleeping bag on top. He brought the lamp from the main room and set it close enough to add a small amount of radiant heat without creating a fire risk. Then he went to the wood stove and added fuel and looked at the situation he was in. He turned on his emergency radio. The reception in the valley below the ridge was fragmented, the signal bouncing off the terrain in ways that made reliable communication difficult. He got fragments of the Weather Service broadcast on the third attempt. What he got was enough. The storm had moved faster than the models had predicted. It was not arriving tomorrow. It was arriving tonight after midnight. And what was arriving was not the moderate weather event the forecast had projected, but something larger and less negotiable. The kind of system that developed when cold air from the northwest collided with moisture from the southwest over the mountains and produced snowfall measured in feet rather than inches, and wind that made the snowfall move horizontally rather than down. He looked at the door to the cabin, at the wood supply he had brought inside, at the man on the floor of the back room, at Juniper in the doorway between them. He was not leaving tonight. He was probably not leaving tomorrow. The practical window for getting the man out of this cabin to a vehicle, to a road, to a hospital had just closed, at least for the immediate future, and the question of survival had shifted from how do I get him out to how do I keep him alive until getting him out becomes possible again. He was good at that question. He had answered it in places that made the situation look comfortable. He went back to work. He inventoried the cabin supplies with the thoroughness of someone who needed to know exactly what he had to work with. The man had come prepared for an extended stay, which was the first piece of good news. There was enough food for at least 10 days for one person, which meant at least 5 for two, which meant food was not the constraint. There was a hand pump on the kitchen counter connected to what he guessed was a cistern beneath the structure, and when he worked it, it produced water, cold and clear, which meant water was not the constraint. There were medical supplies beyond what the improvised bandaging suggested a proper first aid kit on the shelf in the back room that he had missed in his initial sweep, which contained, among other things, a proper antiseptic and gauze and medical tape and a blood pressure cuff and a glucose meter and a bottle of aspirin and a bottle of ibuprofen. The man had come here with the supplies of someone who expected to manage his own medical needs. That detail registered in Decker's mind, and he filed it without examining it further because there was too much to do. He redressed the wound with the proper materials. He got aspirin into the man through a small amount of water, tilting his head carefully and working with the swallowing reflex that was still functional, even in the unconscious state. He took a blood pressure reading that was low but not catastrophically low and recorded it in the small notebook he found on the table beside the coffee cup. He would take readings every 2 hours and track the trend. It was fully dark outside now, and the wind had picked up in the way that preceded the storm, the advance guard of the system, moving through the trees and finding every gap in the cabin structure and making itself known through them. The fire in the wood stove was doing its work, and the temperature in the main room had reached something that could be called tolerable. The back room was still cold, but less cold, and the insulation he had arranged around the man on the floor was doing what insulation did. Decker ate something from his own supplies, not because he was hungry, but because the work ahead required fuel, and running his own system into deficit was not a mistake he would make. He heated water on the camp stove he found in the supplies and made the freeze-dried meal he had packed for tonight, and ate it standing at the kitchen counter watching the back room through the doorway. Juniper had not moved. She was still in the threshold, chin on the floor, watching. She had accepted water when he brought it to her, and had eaten the small amount of food he had, the protein bar from his own supply, broken into pieces and offered to her carefully. She had eaten it without looking away from the man for more than the time the eating required. He thought about what she had done. He had been turning it over in his mind the way he turned things over when he was doing other things, the background processing that his mind did automatically when his hands were occupied. She had left this man. In whatever condition she had been in when the accident happened, in whatever state she had been in afterward, she had made the decision to leave him and to go into the forest and to find help, and she had sustained that decision through injuries that should have stopped her before they did. She could not have known that she would find anyone. The wilderness above this cabin in November was not a place where people reliably appeared. She had gone into it anyway. She had positioned herself and waited, and when Decker came within the range at which she could make herself heard, she had made herself heard. He understood sacrifice. He understood the decision to absorb a cost for the benefit of something or someone that mattered more than the cost. He had been part of teams that made those decisions and had seen what they looked like from the inside, the clarity of them, the absence of ambivalence. The way that kind of decision once made did not get unmade regardless of what happened afterward. He had not expected to see it in a dog. He refilled the bowl with water and brought it to her in the doorway, and she drank without lifting her head more than necessary, keeping the man in her field of vision while she drank. Decker sat down on the floor beside her. Not the cot, not the chair at the table. The floor, his back against the door frame of the back room, close enough to hear the man's breathing without being in the room, close enough to see Juniper without her having to turn her head to find him. He sat and he listened to the wind beginning to build outside and the fire settling into its rhythm in the stove and the man's breathing in the other room, irregular and shallow and still there. He had not sat on the floor next to a dog since he was a child. He could not have said why that particular detail surfaced at that particular moment. It surfaced, and he noted it and let it pass the way you let things pass when there was nothing useful to be done with them. He must have slept at some point in the early hours, because he came awake with the specific quality of alertness that followed a period of rest, not gradually, but all at once, and the sounds had changed around him. The wind was no longer the preview of the storm. It was the storm itself, present and insistent, finding the cabin and pressing on it from all sides in the way of severe weather in the mountains, the kind of wind that didn't gust and subside but pushed in one continuous sustained effort, and under the wind the sound of snow, not the soft silence of light snowfall, but the hiss and scrape of heavy snow moving at speed against every surface that presented itself. He checked the man, pulse slightly stronger. Temperature still low, but the trend on the blood pressure reading he took was marginally better than the one before it. He added antibiotics and aspirin and checked the wound, which was no better but no worse, which was the best he could hope for at this stage. He added wood to the stove. He checked the door, which was holding against the wind. He inventoried the wood supply he had brought inside and calculated how long it would last at the rate the stove was consuming it, and whether he would need to go out for more, and when that would be possible, given the conditions outside, which were not currently compatible with standing upright and moving from one place to another with any degree of control. He was not worried. He had the materials to manage the situation for long enough to survive it. That was the only assessment that mattered. Everything else was detail. It was sometime in the middle of the second day while the storm was still at its peak outside, and the light coming through the small windows of the cabin was the flat gray light of heavy cloud cover over deep snow that the man on the floor of the back room moved, not convulsively, not the alarming movement of someone whose body was doing something uncontrolled. A deliberate movement, slow and careful, the movement of a consciousness returning from a long distance and taking stock of the landscape it was returning to. His right hand moved first, the fingers opening and closing against the fabric of the sleeping bag. Then his head turned slightly to the left. His eyes opened. They were unfocused for a moment, the eyes of someone who was present in the body, but had not yet assembled the context around the body into a coherent picture. Then they focused on the ceiling first. Then, as the head turned further on the room, the lamp, the door frame. On Juniper. She had lifted her head when he moved. She was watching him with her ears forward and her body very still, the specific alertness of an animal that has been waiting for something and is trying to understand if the something has arrived. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said her name, not loudly. Barely above a whisper, the voice of someone whose body had not produced sound in several days and was working back up to it slowly. But a specific sound, a name, and Juniper knew it because her tail moved against the floor when she heard it one slow sweep and then stillness again, as though even that expenditure of energy required careful management. Decker came to the doorway and looked at the man, and the man looked at him. There was the moment that always happened in this situation, the moment between a person waking in unfamiliar circumstances and processing those circumstances, the moment of potential alarm that depended on what the person was and what they had been through and what kind of mental landscape they woke into. Decker had watched that moment in many faces in many places. He knew how to read it. This man's face in that moment showed something he had not expected. Not alarm, not the defensive confusion of someone who did not know where they were. Something closer to acceptance. Like he had woken from a dream into a situation that was different from what the dream had been and was taking note of the difference and had decided the difference was permissible. His eyes moved from Decker to Juniper and back to Decker. "Where did she find you?" he said. His voice was rough and thin, and it clearly cost him something to use it, but he had used it, and the question was the question of a man whose mind was functioning. "About a mile east," Decker said. "On the slope." The man closed his eyes for a moment, opened them again. "How long?" "You've been unconscious for almost 2 days. I found the cabin the night before last." The man absorbed this in the specific way of someone receiving information that is significant and that they suspected but did not know for certain. "Who are you?" "My name is Decker Hale. I was hiking in the wilderness area above here when she found me." The man's eyes moved to Juniper again. She was watching him with the patience of an animal that had found what it was looking for and was prepared to stay for as long as staying was required. "Emmett Broward," the man said. His voice was slightly less rough now, the vocal cords warming back up to their purpose. "This is my grandfather's cabin." Decker nodded. He moved into the room and checked the pulse and the blood pressure and the wound with the efficient movements of someone doing a clinical assessment, and Emmett submitted to the examination without resistance, which was itself a piece of information about the kind of man he was. The wound was better. The inflammation had not increased and might have slightly decreased. The blood pressure had improved. The pulse was still faster than it should be, but it was organized a real rhythm rather than the irregular scramble it had been. You have an infection, Decker said. I've been treating it with what I had. The storm is still on. We're not getting out until it breaks. Emmett looked at the ceiling. The storm, he said. Right. Something in the way he said it made Decker pay attention, not the words, the tone behind them, the tone of someone for whom the storm was an additional piece of information in a larger calculation, not the central problem. Decker filed that and did not pursue it. There would be time. He heated broth from the supplies in the cabin and brought it in a cup and helped the man sit up enough to drink it, which was a careful operation given the wound and the weakness. And Emmett drank it in the slow, deliberate sips of someone who was relearning what their body could accept. While he drank, Juniper moved. For the first time since they had entered the cabin, she left her position in the doorway and crossed the room on her 3 working legs, the splinted one held up and slightly back. And she went to the man on the floor and lay down beside him with her head pressed against his side. Not the wounded side. The other side. She knew. The cup stopped moving in the man's hands. Decker looked at his face and looked away. Some things were private. The storm did not break that day. It did not break the following day either, which was the 3rd day of their being in the cabin together. The snow continued and the wind continued, and the world outside the cabin windows remained the flat white opacity of a system that intended to conclude itself on its own schedule rather than anyone else's. Decker kept the fire, he managed the wound, he tracked the blood pressure readings in the notebook, and watched the trend continue in the right direction slowly, the way recovery from infection and hypothermia moved when the body was doing the work with assistance rather than on its own. He went out for wood twice on the 2nd day, when the wind had diminished enough to make it possible, wearing every layer he had and moving quickly between the door and the woodpile, and the door which was the only kind of movement the conditions outside permitted. Emmett slept a great deal, which was correct. Sleep was the mechanism by which the body allocated resources toward repair, and repair was what the body needed to be doing. When he was awake, he was coherent increasingly, so as the infection responded to the antibiotics and the hypothermia continued to resolve. He asked no questions about Decker's background or the circumstances that had brought him to this part of the mountains. He asked about Juniper's leg, and Decker told him what he had done and what he assessed the prognosis to be, and Emmett listened and nodded without comment. They did not talk very much. This suited them both as far as Decker could tell. On the 3rd evening, when the light had gone and the fire was doing its steady work, and Juniper was asleep, pressed against Emmett's side, Emmett said something that was not a question and not exactly a statement. She's never done that before, he said. Gone to find someone. She's never left me. Decker was adding wood to the stove. He closed the door of the stove and sat down on the chair beside it. She left because she needed to, he said. Emmett was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I just didn't think she would. He paused. She's not supposed to be able to do that with her leg. Decker did not respond to this. There was nothing useful to add to it. How long before she can use it again? Emmett asked. Assuming the fracture is what I think it is, and it heals cleanly a few months before she's fully weight-bearing. She'll need a proper cast, probably some rehabilitation. She'll be fine. Emmett looked at the dog against his side, the chest moving with the slow breath of deep sleep. She's always been fine, he said. She's the type. He said it with the particular quality of someone describing a characteristic they admired and were grateful for, and were not quite sure they deserved. Decker looked at the stove. On the wall near the doorway there were photographs. He had seen them on the first night and had noted them and had not looked at them again because looking at the private record of a stranger's life in a crisis felt like a trespass. But they were visible from where he was sitting, and in the firelight they were visible enough to see. A classroom, children, small ones, 6 or 7 years old, in a room with drawings on the walls, and a man standing among them with his hand on the shoulder of one child. The man was younger than the man on the floor of this room, but unmistakably the same person, the same bone structure, the same quality of presence. Beside it, another photograph, the same man on a porch outdoors in summer with a woman standing close to him with the ease of someone who had been close to him for a very long time. The mountain in the background. This mountain probably. This cabin's porch. On the frame of the second photograph in handwriting, he had not been close enough to read before he could now make out a name and dates. He looked away. The wind shifted outside the first change in the wind's direction in 3 days, and both men were quiet and listened to it. Decker added wood to the stove. The night settled around them, and the fire kept its promise, and Juniper slept against the man whose life she had gone out into the cold to save, and Decker sat with his back against the cabin wall and listened to the breathing in the room and the wind outside, and thought about nothing in particular, which was the closest he had come to peace in a very long time. The storm broke on the 4th morning. Decker knew it before he looked outside because the sound changed. The wind that had been a constant presence for 3 days, a sound so persistent that he had stopped consciously hearing it and had started only noticing when it shifted, simply stopped. Not diminished, stopped. The silence it left behind had a specific quality, the full and absolute quiet that followed major weather in the mountains, a silence that was not empty but full, the way a room feels after a long and difficult conversation has finally concluded. He stood at the cabin window and looked out. The world outside was white in every direction, deeply and completely white. The landscape transformed by the storm into something that bore no resemblance to the terrain he had walked through 4 days ago. The trees were white, the ground was white. The sky above was the clear, hard blue of high pressure arrived, and established a sky so intensely blue against the white below it that looking at both simultaneously required the eye to make an adjustment. Beautiful in the specific way of things that had been through something and were now still. He checked Emmett first, as he had checked him every 2 hours through the nights, and found him as he had found him for the past 24 hours, which was measurably better. The blood pressure was reading in the low normal range. The pulse was regular and stronger than it had been. The wound, when he changed the dressing with the careful precision that changing dressings in a backcountry environment required, showed clear evidence that the infection was losing ground. The inflammation was down. The tissue around the margins of the wound looked more like tissue that was healing and less like tissue that was in a state of ongoing emergency. Emmett was awake when Decker finished the dressing change and was watching him with the alert eyes of a man who was returning to himself steadily, the specific quality of awareness that came back when the body was no longer spending everything it had on the immediate work of staying alive and could afford to invest some resources in being present and paying attention. Better, Decker said, answering the question that Emmett had not asked. Emmett nodded. He had accepted Decker's medical assessments without challenge or excessive gratitude, which Decker respected. He either trusted the assessment or had decided that arguing with it served no purpose, and either position was a reasonable one. Storm's done, Decker said. Emmett was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window at the quality of the light coming through it. How much snow, he asked. Deep. I'll know better when I go out, but deep. Emmett closed his eyes briefly, not in distress, in calculation. Decker left him to it and went to the door and put on every layer he had and went outside. The snow was at the level of his hip in the open areas around the cabin, lower under the trees where the canopy had intercepted some of what fell higher in the places where the wind had loaded it against obstacles. He waded through it carefully to get a sense of the depth and consistency and to locate the trailhead, if locating it was possible, which it was not because the trail no longer existed as a visible feature in the landscape. It was under somewhere between 3 and 4 feet of snow, and the terrain between the cabin and the nearest road was unmarked and steep in sections, and would be extremely slow going on foot, even for one person moving without encumbrance. He did not have a satellite phone. He had not brought one because the permit area he had planned to hike in was well trafficked enough that it had not seemed necessary, which was a calculation he would revise for future reference. He had the emergency locator beacon in his pack, the one he always carried, because some habits were non-negotiable, and it was working its light, pulsing the slow green of a device that was operational and connected and waiting to be told to do something. He stood in the snow outside the cabin and looked at the terrain and thought about what was possible. Getting Emmett out under his own power was not possible. Emmett could stand probably and could move slowly with support, but the combination of post-infection weakness and the wound and the terrain and the snow depth meant that getting him to a road under his own power was not a realistic plan, not safely, not in a time frame that was medically acceptable given the state of the wound and the ongoing need for proper antibiotic treatment, which meant calling for help. He was not reluctant to call for help. He did not have a particular investment in solving the situation without assistance. He had solved the immediate survival problem because there had been no other option. But calling for help now, when calling for help was the correct course of action, was simply calling for help. He went back inside and got the locator beacon from his pack and activated the emergency signal. The device confirmed activation with a series of tones, and the light pattern changed to indicate that the signal was transmitting. The nearest search and rescue coordination center would receive the signal within minutes. The response time from there depended on resources, conditions, and logistics, none of which he could control. So he returned the device to a position where it had clear sky exposure and went back inside. He made coffee with the supplies in the cabin. He brought a cup to Emmett and one for himself and sat down on the chair beside the wood stove. And Emmett drank his coffee sitting up against the wall of the back room with Juniper against his side, the two of them making a particular picture of something that had survived something. They sat in the cabin quiet and drank the coffee, and the morning light moved across the floor as the sun rose and the cabin warmed with the double effect of the fire and the sunlight coming through the windows. And neither man spoke for a long time, which was comfortable in the way that silence between people who have been through something together becomes comfortable. You activated the beacon, Emmett said. It was not a question. Yes. Emmett nodded. He looked down at the dog. She'll need to see a vet as soon as we're out, he said. The leg. I know. The splint has held well, but she needs imaging and a proper cast. Emmett ran his hand along Juniper's back. The slow, deliberate gesture of someone who was taking the measure of something they were grateful to still be able to touch. I've had her for 14 months, he said. She showed up at my door in October of last year. Just appeared. No collar, no chip, nobody in the area, missing a dog. The vet said she was probably 3 years old, maybe a little younger. He did not say more immediately, and Decker did not prompt him. The cabin was quiet around them, and there was no urgency in the silence. My wife died in March of that year, Emmett said. Margaret. We were married 31 years. He said it without the quality of someone who had said it many times and was saying it again. He said it with the quality of someone who was still in the process of understanding what the words meant. I was a school teacher, he said. 32 years at the same elementary school in Durango. Retired the year before Margaret died. She was supposed to retire 2 years after me, and then we were going to travel. She had a list. She had been keeping it for years. We used to talk about it on Sunday mornings when we had time to sit over coffee and plan things that weren't immediate. He stopped. She died in March, he said again. The list is still on the refrigerator. Decker looked at the coffee cup in his hands. Juniper showed up in October, Emmett continued. 7 months later, I hadn't been doing well in the specific way that people who have always had someone don't do well when they don't have them anymore. The days had a quality to them. You know the quality I mean. Decker did not respond, but Emmett did not require a response. He was speaking to put words to something that had existed without words. She showed up, and I kept her, Emmett said. I wasn't planning to keep a dog. We had never had a dog. Margaret was allergic in a mild way, and it hadn't seemed worth it. But Juniper showed up and looked at me the way she looks at things, and I kept her, and the days after that had a different quality. He looked at the dog, a better quality. He was quiet for a moment. I came up here at the start of November, he said. I've been coming to this cabin since I was a child. My grandfather built it. My father and I used to come in the summers. After he died, I kept coming. After Margaret and I married, we came together sometimes. It was always a place that was separate from ordinary life, a place that held things. He stopped again. The stopping had a different quality from before. I came up here, he said, and then he did not continue that sentence. He moved to a different one. I fell on the third day. Coming down from the ridge, there was ice under the snow. I went down hard on a rock, and something went into my side. The branch stub. I could feel it, but I was far enough from the cabin that getting back was the first priority. Decker nodded. He had reconstructed most of this from the physical evidence. When I got back, I bandaged it as well as I could, and I thought it would be fine. He paused. It was not fine. I could feel the infection starting by the second day, but the storm was coming and there was nothing to be done about it. And I knew I was in trouble by the third day, but I couldn't stand up long enough to do anything productive. He looked at Juniper. She wouldn't leave me. I kept telling her to go, he said. I knew if she went down to the road, there was some chance someone would find her and follow her back. That's how it works in the stories. He said it with a very slight quality of irony. But she wouldn't go. She stayed with me, and I thought that was it. I thought that was going to be it for both of us. His hand was still moving along Juniper's back, slow and deliberate. And then I woke up, and she wasn't there, he said. And I thought I was already gone, that I was dreaming, or the fever had gotten to the point where I was seeing things. But I wasn't. She had gone. Decker looked at the dog. She was awake, her amber eyes calm, watching Emmett's face. He understood now from the full context something he had only partially understood before. The position Emmett had been in when Decker found him, the way the cabin had been when he arrived, the detail that had registered on the first night and that he had filed and not examined. There had been no attempt to get to the radio that sat on the shelf in the main room, the radio that would have transmitted a distress signal to the same coordination center that was now receiving the locator beacon signal. The radio that a man with 32 years of coming to this cabin would have known was there and would have known how to use. Emmett had not tried to reach the radio. Decker looked at the man. Emmett was looking at him. He had always been a perceptive person, Decker suspected, and he was perceptive enough now, even diminished by injury and recovery, to know what Decker had just understood. The silence in the room had a specific weight. I wasn't sure I wanted to be found, Emmett said. That's the honest accounting of it. I came up here to figure out if I did, whether there was enough reason to go back, whether the going back was something I could commit to. He looked at Juniper, and then she was gone, and that was a different situation. He said it simply and without performance, not asking for a response, just putting the truth of it in the air where it could be acknowledged. Decker sat with the weight of what had been said. He had been in the presence of this kind of truth before in the specific environments where people said things they would not say anywhere else, because the conditions stripped away the layers that made not saying things easier. He knew how to be in the presence of it without trying to manage it or redirect it or diminish it. He also knew sitting there that he owed Emmett the same honesty that Emmett had offered him. I didn't come to the mountains to die, Decker said. I want to be clear about that. He paused. But I came here because I had run out of reasons to be anywhere in particular. And running out of reasons is its own kind of problem that doesn't always stay theoretical. Emmett looked at him with the eyes of a man who had taught children for 32 years and had learned to read what was behind what people said. She changed the calculation, Decker said. He looked at Juniper. Finding her changed it. Neither man said anything for a while. The sunlight continued its movement across the floor of the cabin. The fire in the stove settled, and Decker added wood and it rebuilt itself. Outside, at some point in the middle of the morning, he heard the sound of a helicopter distant, and then closer, and then very close, the particular sound of rotors working in mountain air, and he went outside and stood in the snow with his arm raised, and the helicopter saw him. The search and rescue team was 4 people, efficient and well-equipped, accustomed to this terrain and this kind of situation. They assessed Emmett and agreed with Decker's assessment and made arrangements for evacuation. One of them looked at Juniper with the evaluating eye of someone who had seen injured dogs before in these contexts and confirmed what Decker had said about the splint holding well. They rigged a litter for Emmett and they brought him out of the back room and through the main room carefully, and Juniper walked beside him on her 3 working legs, not letting him get more than a few feet from her the entire length of the trip from the back room to the outside of the cabin. At the door, Emmett stopped the team for a moment. He looked at Decker, who was behind them with the pack on his back, ready to go. Thank you, Emmett said. Not just for the medical things, for the other things. Decker nodded. They went out into the snow and the clear, cold air of the San Juan Mountains the morning after the storm. The helicopter could carry Emmett and 2 of the rescue team and Juniper, who was lifted carefully and held by Emmett on the flight down. There was not room for Decker, which was not a problem. 2 of the rescue team stayed behind, and they broke trail through the snow on snowshoes, going at a pace that was faster than Decker would have been able to manage without snowshoes. And they reached a road in 2 hours where a vehicle was waiting. Decker rode in the vehicle to the town at the base of the mountains. He knew where the regional hospital was because the rescue team had told him, and he went there not because he needed medical attention. He had already been cleared by the team lead on scene, but because it was where they had taken Emmett. The hospital was a regional facility, competent and not crowded in November, and they had put Emmett in a room on the 2nd floor and were doing what hospitals did, the proper IV antibiotics and the proper wound care and the imaging that confirmed there was no internal damage beyond the infection and the tissue injury. Decker found out the room number from the nurse at the desk and went upstairs. Emmett was awake. The improvement that had begun in the cabin had continued in the transition, the body responding to proper treatment with the speed of a system that had been trying to respond for days without adequate tools. His color was better. His voice when he said Decker's name was recognizably his own voice, rather than the reduced version the injury had left him with. Juniper was not in the room which was expected. She was at the veterinary clinic 3 blocks away. Emmett told him where they had taken her directly from the landing zone. He had called the clinic from the room and they had confirmed she was there and would be seen within the hour. Decker sat in the chair beside the bed, and they talked for a while about the practical things, what the doctors had said, what the treatment plan was, when Emmett would be discharged, what the cabin had sustained in the storm, which was not much. The structure had been built by someone who knew how to build for mountain winters. And then Emmett said, "What happens for you now?" Decker looked at the window. The view from the 2nd floor was of the town and the mountains above it, the peaks still white from the storm, the sky above them, the same hard blue it had been that morning. "I had a truck at the trailhead," he said. "I'll get back to it at some point. After that, I don't have a clear plan." He said it without distress. It was simply the factual condition of his life at the moment. The planning had been something he had not been able to do further than a week in any direction for a while now, and he had stopped fighting that and was living in the week he was in. Emmett was quiet for a moment. I'm going to be in this hospital for at least 4 days, he said. Then I'll need to be somewhere for a week or two before I can drive back up for the cabin to close it down for winter. There are things that need to be done before the hard freezes. I can't do them alone in the condition I'll be in. He said it in the straightforward manner of someone presenting a practical situation. The cabin has 2 rooms, he said. Decker looked at him. I know. Emmett said, you know that I know what you're offering, and you know that I know why. Decker said nothing. Emmett looked at the ceiling. What she did, he said, going out into that forest with a broken leg. She made a decision, he paused. I'm trying to make the same kind of decision, he paused again. It's harder when you're the one doing the deciding and not the one being decided for. Decker understood this completely. He sat with it. After a while, he said, I'll check on the dog. The veterinary clinic was 3 blocks on a main street that was quiet in November, a small town street with the specific character of places that existed primarily for their own residents rather than for visitors. He walked it without hurrying. The clinic was warm inside and smelled of the particular combination of antiseptic and animal that all such places shared. He told the woman at the desk who he was, and she went to the back and came out and told him that Juniper was out of sedation, and that the fracture had been a clean midshaft break and had been set properly and cast, and that the prognosis was excellent, and that she would need 6 to 8 weeks in the cast, and some rehabilitation after, and would almost certainly be fully functional afterward. He asked if he could see her. They brought him back to where she was, a recovery kennel, warm and clean with a water bowl and a blanket, and the hard fiberglass cast on her right front leg, the rest of her looking as she had looked in the cabin, but cleaner, the mud and blood cleaned away the wound on her side, properly dressed the evidence of what she had been through, present but managed. She saw him when he came to the kennel. Her tail moved, not the slow, deliberate sweep he had come to know as her communication signal. The real wag, the full body involvement of a dog, expressing something uncomplicated and genuine, the thing dogs do when the person they are glad to see arrives. He crouched down to the level of the kennel, and she pressed her nose through the wire, and he put his hand against it. He thought about what she had done. He had turned it over many times in the days in the cabin, and he had not found a better way to understand it than the way he had understood it from the beginning, which was simply that she had decided the man in the cabin was worth saving, and had done what the decision required, regardless of what it cost her. She had not deliberated about it. She had not weighed it against her own survival in any way that produced hesitation. She had made the decision and had acted on it fully. He had known people who were capable of that. Not many. They were the ones he had trusted completely when trust completely was the requirement. He stayed at the kennel for a while, his hand against the wire, and she pressed against it from the other side, and neither of them needed anything more from the moment than what the moment contained. He walked back to the hospital in the late afternoon. The town around him had the quality of a place that was settling into its evening, the light going golden on the storefronts, a few people on the sidewalks, the particular peace of a small mountain town after a major storm, when the storm is over and the town is intact and the relief of that is still fresh. He walked through it and felt the cold on his face and thought about nothing in particular, which continued to be the closest thing to peace he had reliable access to. Emmett was sleeping when he got to the room. He sat in the chair and waited. When Emmett woke, the room was dimmer, the evening light outside having gone from gold to gray. She's good, Decker said. Clean fracture. Cast is on. They say full recovery. Emmett closed his eyes for a moment. Good, he said. They sat in the room in the quiet of a hospital evening, and outside the window, the mountains were darkening against the sky, and the lights of the town were coming on one by one. Decker looked at the mountains. He thought about the moment 4 days ago when he had been standing at the junction of the obvious answer and the right answer and had chosen the right one. He thought about the chain of decisions that had followed from that choice, each one hinging on the one before it, in the way that consequential choices hinged. He thought about what he would have been doing tonight if he had made the other choice, if he had turned back toward the trailhead with a dog in his arms and had not followed where she was trying to lead him. He would have been in a motel somewhere probably, or in his truck. Working through the remaining days of the trip he had planned, doing what he had come to do, which was to use his body and the mountain to keep his mind occupied enough to function. It was not a bad life. It was not a sufficient life. He thought about Emmett's word, the calculation. She had changed his calculation. That was what he had said in the cabin, and it was what he had meant, and it was true in the specific way that true things were true, without qualification, without the caveats that made most things he said about himself only partially true. Finding juniper in the forest had changed the calculation, not resolved it, not answered the questions that had brought him to the mountains in the first place, but changed the nature of the mathematics. When you were responsible for something that needed you, the equations worked differently. He thought about the cabin in the mountains and the wood that would need to come in before the hard freezes and the things that needed to be done before winter closed the access road and the 2 rooms that the cabin had. He thought about what Emmett had said, what she did, going out into that forest with a broken leg. She made a decision. I'm trying to make the same kind of decision. Making the decision was the thing. The rest followed from the decision. He sat in the hospital room while Emmett slept, and the mountain night settled outside the window, and the monitors kept their quiet record of the man in the bed recovering steadily from the things that had been done to him by the mountain, and the cold, and the days alone, and Decker thought about decisions. In the morning, when the light came through the window, and the hospital began its day around them, with the sounds of a morning shift starting and carts and hallways, and someone's voice on the intercom at a volume that assumed no one was sleeping. Emmett opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling and then at the chair beside the bed, at Decker, who was still in the chair. You stayed, Emmett said. Decker looked at him. I'll need someone to drive the truck back down when we're ready, he said. It's still at the trailhead. Emmett looked at him for a moment. That's a practical reason, he said. It's a reason Decker said. Emmett almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, it was the expression that preceded one, but he was a man who had been injured and was recovering and had been through a substantial amount in the past week, and a full smile might have required more of him than he had available at the moment. There's coffee in the family room down the hall, Emmett said. If you want to find it. Decker stood up from the chair, the stiffness of a night in a hospital chair making itself known in the usual places. He walked out into the hallway and turned toward the family room, and behind him, in the hospital room, Emmett looked at the ceiling and the morning light moved across it. And outside the window, the mountains were there, the way they were always there, large and indifferent, and exactly what they were, which was the same thing they had always been, which was the place where certain things became clear that could not become clear anywhere else. 3 weeks later, the discharge from the hospital had happened on schedule. The recovery at the house of Emmett's neighbor in town, a woman named Patricia, who had been a colleague of Emmett's at the school, and who had a guest room and no apparent objection to offering it, had gone the way recoveries went when the body had enough left in it to complete the work. Juniper had come out of the veterinary clinic on day 6, cast on the right front leg, moving on 3 legs, with the adaptable confidence of a dog, for whom obstacles were logistical rather than philosophical. Decker had been in and out during those 3 weeks. He had his own situation to manage the truck to recover from the trailhead. Once the road was plowed, some communications to deal with some logistics. He came back because coming back was the thing that was happening, and he did not examine it too closely because examining things too closely had a way of producing reasons not to do them. The morning of the 4th week, Emmett was clear to drive. The wound had healed cleanly. The infection fully resolved the tissue, knitting itself back together with the stubbornness of a body that had decided not to stop. He could drive, he could do moderate physical activity. The cabin needed to be closed down before the next major weather system came through. Decker put his pack in Emmett's truck, the way he had been putting his pack into vehicles for 15 years efficiently and without the question of whether this was the right thing to do, because that question had been answered and the answer was in the pack being in the truck. They drove up the mountain in the morning light with Juniper in the back seat, her cast enclosed leg extended at the angle that worked for her chin on the door sill, watching the terrain go by with the steady attention she brought to everything. Emmett drove without talking much, which was appropriate. Decker looked out the window at the mountains coming up around them as the road climbed the aspens bare and the snow still deep in the high country, the peaks against the sky and the specific configuration that this particular range made. At the trailhead where Decker's truck was parked, covered in the snow that the storm had left on it, and the subsequent weeks had partially melted and refrozen, Emmett stopped the truck. Decker looked at it. Then he looked at the mountains above the trailhead. Somewhere up there was the slope where he had heard the sound that he had followed through the trees. Somewhere up there was the place where the world had changed in the specific way that the world changed when you chose the right answer instead of the obvious one. Emmett was quiet beside him. "I'll get it on the way back down," Decker said. Emmett put the truck in gear and they drove on up the mountain toward the cabin. When they arrived and got out, Juniper was first onto the ground, moving with the three-legged confidence she had developed over the weeks of cast wearing, and she went straight to the cabin door and sat in front of it and looked back at them with the expression she used when she was waiting for someone to do the obvious thing. Emmett unlocked the door. Inside the cabin was cold and quiet in the way of a place that had been closed for weeks, holding the memory of the fire and the storm and the days in between in the way that places held what had happened in them. The photographs were on the wall where they had always been. The coffee cup was on the table where it had been left. The notebook with the blood pressure readings was on the shelf where Decker had left it. He picked up the notebook and looked at the readings, recorded in his handwriting, the story of a man coming back from the edge written in numbers and trends. He set it back on the shelf. They worked through the afternoon, the two of them, closing down the systems that needed to be closed for winter, securing what needed securing, draining what needed draining. The physical work of it was straightforward, and the two of them moved through it without requiring much communication, each finding the next task and completing it with the competence of people who were used to working in conditions that required competence. Juniper moved between them through the afternoon, going from one to the other, checking on them both with the regularity of an animal that had decided it was responsible for two people and was taking the responsibility seriously. In the late afternoon, when the work was done and the cabin was closed and ready for whatever winter brought, they stood outside in the cold, clear air and looked at the mountains above them. The light at this hour in November was the amber light of late afternoon, the sun already near the ridgeline, the shadows long across the snow. It was very quiet. The specific quiet of the mountains after work is done a quiet that was not empty but full, that held the day and its completion and the coming of the evening. Decker looked at the slope above the cabin, at the ridge, at the place somewhere on the slope where he had crouched in the wet forest and found an animal that should not have been alive, and had looked into its eyes and understood that it had been waiting for him. He set his pack down, not leaned it against the cabin wall in the way of putting something down temporarily while you deal with something else. Set it down on the snow beside him in the way of putting something down, because you have arrived somewhere and things that were for traveling can stay where they are for a while. Emmett was looking at the mountains and did not turn when Decker set the pack down, but the quality of the silence beside him changed slightly, the way silence changed when something had shifted. Juniper came and sat in front of Decker and looked up at him. He looked down at her. The cast would come off in 3 more weeks. She would need the rehabilitation after that, the careful work of rebuilding the muscle and the trust in the leg, the weeks of gradual return to full use. She would be fine. The vet had said it clearly, and Decker had believed him, and he still believed him. She would run again on that slope. She would move through that forest again on 4 legs, the way she had moved through it on 3, with the particular quality of attention she brought to the world, reading it and navigating it and finding in it whatever it contained that was worth finding. He thought about a dog with a broken leg who had gone into a November forest to find help for someone who needed it and who had found him and who had looked at him with the eyes of an animal that had known exactly who it was looking for. He crouched down and put his hand on her head. She leaned into it. The mountains were very large and very still around them, and the evening was coming with the cold of high altitude in winter, and there was wood to bring in before full dark and a fire to build, and Decker had a particular skill set that included building fires in difficult conditions, and he intended to use it. He stood up. He left the pack where it was and walked with Emmett and Juniper toward the woodpile and the work that was waiting, and the cabin door was open behind them, and the amber light lay across the snow in long lines that connected one thing to another, the way light did, the way certain things did, the way the moment in the forest 4 days ago was connected to this moment and to all the moments that would follow it. The fire would be good tonight. He was certain of that.